We are here today to celebrate the late lamented the Herald, but also celebrate the days when working for a newspaper was vaguely fun, the days before consultants, clickbait and cutbacks. We are here today to celebrate the great careers forged in that great cradle of journalism that was the Herald, and also tell some stories as well down the track. I have a great affinity with everybody in this room because I began my career as a copy boy on the late lamented Sydney Sun up in Sydney, and my abiding recollection of my duties for that period were going across the road to the early opener to buy long necks for the subs at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and then while there dragging a few tired and emotional journalists off the bar stools back to the Sun building to file their stories. So I thought that was a great foundation for a journalistic career. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jan McGuinness.
You're all trained observers, so anybody who was expecting Dallas Winstead will know that I am not that dashing heartthrob who originally had this gig, but I'll do my best to fill in and take you on a journey down memory lane. Now, I've written this, as you can tell, and I don't want any critiques, any subbing comments. Keep it all to yourselves until the end, okay? So, picture this as I attempt to guide you through a lost world and introduce you to a few of its strange inhabitants. It's sometime in the mid to late 1960s as we enter the foyer of 44 Flinders Street, home to the Herald and Weekly Times, and take the lift to the 3rd floor. There we alight and turn left down Mahogany Row, past the offices of the Editor-in-Chief, the Chairman, and the Women's Department on one side, and those of the Sun News Pictorial on the other, until reaching the big brass-framed glass plate doors, beyond which lies the Herald newsroom. Entering this vast open office, we are confronted by a sea of desks where journos, most with a cigarette dangling from their lips, pound furiously at manual typewriters, which are bolted to the desks. Artificial light illuminates this enclosed space, where the jangle of dozens of ringing telephones fill the air, heavy with the smell of printer's ink and cigarette smoke. Directly opposite, in a cordoned-off area, sits the Chief of Staff, John Fitzgerald, surrounded by telephones and conferring with his secretary, B. Warren, who stands leaning forward over his desk, propped on outstretched arms. Beyond them, in a glassed-off area, is the subs room, presided over by John Lay, John Kiley, and Peter Marr. And beyond them again, Herald Sport, where sit Alf Brown, chief football writer and reigning oracle of all that Melbourne holds dear, with grumpy old Jack Elliott, the racing writer. Cast around the newsroom and you'll see Bill Tipping perched in his own little wooden pen, hard at work on another of his brilliant in black and white columns. Nearby is John Sorrell, who's fast turning his on-the-spot daily feature into a must-read. While in through the door strides Jeff Clancy for a quick word with Fitzy. Jeff is the police roundsman and crime is the heart of the Herald's news offering. He gets around town in a chauffeur-driven Chevy, tuned permanently to the police radio channels, and works out of police rounds, alongside the Russell Street Police headquarters in a film noir world populated by Damon Runyon characters with names to match, like Harry the Horse Lovett from the ABC and the Herald's own Fred the Needle, aka Peter Fitzgerald. Away from the fray, but just across the corridor, beyond the newsroom and rarely seen, sits the editor, Stewie Brown, reputed to be a former communist and to live on a boat in Williamstown, and remembered by your guide for refusing her a $5 a week pay rise on the basis that there were men with families more deserving than she. Around lunchtime, the elegant and delightfully named Earl Grey emerges from editing the letters to the editor page to join Keith Dunstan from The Sun and that other old dude who gets around in spats for a spot of lunch over at the Melbourne Club. Elsewhere in the building, Jack Eddy, the finance editor, is readying for another bout at Lou Richards' pub across the road. As remembered by Gary Barker in a piece for The Age back in 2004, Jack was an alcoholic genius who started the day at Lou's drinking hotties. Cold beer hurt his fillings, so the barmaid tempered his glass with boiling water before filling it. He could be legless but still dictate a masterly piece. Jack was an old mate and contemporary of the executive chairman Sir John Williams, described in a tribute on his passing in 1982 as autocratic, idiosyncratic, and hard drinking. Many were the tales, possibly apocryphal, that attested to the latter. But my favourite, and I've been hearing a few on the table today about Jack, concerns an encounter between a sober Sir John and a worse-for-wear Jack Eddy late one evening in Mahogany Row. Eddy commenced singing Sir John's praises, telling him what a wonderful bloke and all-round great journalist he was. After all, Sir John had overseen the growth of the Herald and Weekly Times into the country's biggest media group. Sir John told Eddy firmly to tone it down because he was embarrassing him. "Well, I never," replied an outraged Eddy. "Everyone else round here says you're a right old bastard." And that's not actually what he said. He said another word, which I'm not going to repeat, but it comes after bastard in the alphabet. Apart from this cast of contrasting and colourful characters, it will be the Dickensian surroundings you notice on this long-ago visit to Flinders Street. The lino-covered walls reek of printer's ink and squeak as you walk along them, past the old cage lifts, or up to the ambient-free cafeteria on the roof, where Eric Page won the Herald food critic gig by being able to devour the most pies in one sitting. Printing machines rumble in the bowels of the building. Floors of comps, lino typesetters, layout artists and proofreaders occupy the floors above editorial. The sensation of being part of something vast and tangible is palpable and confirmed by the flotilla of Herald trucks in the loading dock piled high with the latest edition. Leaving the Herald and Weekly Times building and strolling down Flinders Street, you'll pass an army of newspaper boys screaming, "Herald!" and be overwhelmed by a sense of excitement not to be matched, however clever and efficient is that digital world we now inhabit. So there you have it, a potted look at the context for my own experience of what those years were like. I was going to say I'm chuffed to be following Ranald. Well, I'm chuffed to be preceding Ranald, a revered former employer under whose guidance I flourished at the age. But by then I'd hit my straps and had become worth employing, which was hardly the case when the Herald and Weekly Times took me on as a graduate cadet in the late 1960s. So while my memories of those early days are somewhat random, twisted and blighted by fear and confusion, it's to the Herald that I owe whatever skills I have. Don't laugh. Those years drilled me in the hard lessons, taught me how to write and to leave everything to the last minute, so as to enjoy that exhilarating, creative burst of adrenaline under pressure. As all of us trained on afternoon newspapers know, there's nothing like that series of deadlines throughout the day to get you moving. It's addictive. My memories are personal by definition, but I hope they revive and resonate with some of yours, even the blokes. Because although females now dominate journalism courses by a factor of about 3 to 1, back then the Herald and Weekly Times and journalism per se was blokey heaven, fueled by cigarette smoke, alcohol and testosterone. Us girls were congratulated on receiving equal pay, unheard of in any other professional craft at the time, but equal opportunity wasn't part of the equation, making it that much harder for us to survive, let alone succeed in an already highly competitive environment. Now I'm going to mention a few names, and I know there are thousands more, but Di Rayner, Liz Hooper, Ann Pilmer, Rosie Rule, Eve Syme, Belinda Lamb, Maureen Gilchrist, Julia Adams and Veronica Ridge were among the contemporaries of mine. All of them and the blokes will have different memories of our shared experience, reflecting the age-old conflict between truth and accuracy, but here goes. Being a uni grad, I was at least 3 years behind my peers in the things that mattered, like how to write and even recognise a story. Today, those trying to crack journalism without a degree are the anomaly, but back then, graduates were a novel and despised species, a privileged, overeducated lot with no practical knowledge of the real world. By comparison, my predominantly male peers were uniformly cool and experienced and already making their names on various rounds or running sections like the under-20s page. This was the fiefdom of Ernie Rates when I arrived, and I remember being dazzled by his floral shirts and matching ties. Us girls weren't even allowed to wear slacks to work, not even a trendy pantsuit, because of the improbable likelihood of being sent to Government House or to interview the Prime Minister. For those with a romantic Clark Kent, His Girl Friday, hold the front page inspired notion of newspapers, sailing through the big glass doors into the brightly lit, noisy Herald world was like entering a waking dream. But as one of those classic cases of someone approaching journalism from the "I love reading and people say I can write" category, I was clueless about what it entailed and bewildered from the get-go. I arrived in the midst of a February heatwave, having spent years incarcerated in an all-girls school, followed by 3 years in a female-only university college. Naive and unworldly doesn't begin to cut it. One of my first jobs was to cover the release of a BHP OH&S report. The stats and injuries weren't all that numerous, but the sorts of accidents described were quite alarming. I kicked off what became a front-page story, thoroughly reworked by someone else, with a description of that day's weather. Cadet Councillor Bob Coleman's weekly pointers had no way of outpacing my floundering attempts at journalism. Shortly after the BHP fiasco, I was sent to cover a magistrate's court in Brunswick, hearing hundreds of cases brought against householders for abusing water restriction bans. I phoned in with a smattering of names, but no addresses, no occupations. Not even those wonderful female copy takers in the phone room, my champions on so many occasions, could save my bacon on that day, and I became a legend in the subs room for all the wrong reasons. We're not filing the stock exchange reports, shipping news and Muslim prayer times, or wandering around trying to find courts in outer whoop whoop. I was on the road with a photographer, which made finding the job easier, but arrival not necessarily guaranteed. There were exceptions, but by and large I remember them as a coterie of drunks and crazy drivers. On the way to Olinda, for example, we stopped at every pub along the way, while Bert Roeder's method of parallel parking was to crash and bash the vehicle on either end while mounting the footpath, only slightly less harrowing than driving down the middle of the road in his care as he ripped through the gears from 1 to 3 to save time. Back in the newsroom, I lived in terror of John Carley, the chief sub, who'd regularly fly out of the subs room, waving my copy over his head and screaming something like, "Miss McGuinness, you spelled principal with an L-E instead of an A-L." Today, of course, I'd require trauma therapy and he'd be counselled for bullying, but I well knew that I'd tried his patient beyond that which he was able, and I never made those errors again. I was not alone in my confusion. One day, the roar of a fire engine could be heard speeding down Flinders Street. "Get that!" Fitzy, our redoubtable Chief of Staff, growled, head down, arm up, waving at the big plate glass doors onto Mahogany Row. An eager beaver, Sean Hanrahan, took up the challenge and duly returned, not with the details of the fire, but with a girl who'd been passing the doors at the time. At the end of such a day, one could always repair to the top bar at the Phoenix across the road, and usually did. There, gun feature writer Alan Stewart serenaded young female cadets night after drunken night with "To Dream the Impossible Dream," and I consumed more beer than I've ever done before or since, to the point that one night I got home to Parkville without my car, which remained parked in Tin Pan Alley, not because I was cautious and responsible, because I'd completely forgotten that I even owned a car. Other diversions included being sent off to shorthand classes once or twice a week at a school run by 2 old dears known to someone in the Herald hierarchy, and situated in a dusty classroom set up in a building conveniently close to the Australia Hotel and other watering holes. Carilla Gantner, who did a sort of gap year in journalism before segueing into a career in diplomacy and the arts, was held up to us all as a shining of someone who had mastered the skill in only 6 weeks. It could be done. But few of us were equal to the challenge and easily led astray. The boys always suggested the pub or a nearby coffee shop, and 9 times out of 10, that's where we'd end up. Our social life extended beyond the pub, since every Saturday night there was a Herald party in a rotating series of suburban flats and houses belonging to the older married journos and their long-suffering wives. John Lay organised parties also for the cadets at his place in Eltham, and there was, I guess, an overarching feeling and culture of family. But that said, it was a boot camp, out of which lifelong bonds and friendships were born, and I guess that's largely why we're here today. Given that I was no competition to anyone, I received a lot of help and advice and mentoring, not least from Bob Coleman, the reluctant cadet counsellor who was instructed to take me on as a special case. He clued me in and taught me to write simple, elegant prose, to develop a voice of my own and an eye for the unusual. Along the way, we became firm friends and often had lunch together, unfortunately choosing places frequented by Fred Daly, our philandering editor-in-chief, and his current girlfriend, one of whom I learned today was working in the phone room. The straighty 180 Bob was mortified that Fred would think we too were an item. At one stage, I suspect the hierarchy tried to shake me off by sending me to Purgatory, aka 3DB, to write news bulletins from 4 a.m. until midday. The radio station was part of the Herald and Weekly Times empire and housed in a dungeon below Flinders Lane, where a highlight was the breakfast arrival of 4 and 20 pies and other fast food freebies. But I prevailed and hung on somehow as fellow cadets powered from strength to strength and managed to avoid women's, which rightly or wrongly I perceived as a dead end. Indeed, I asked to go to police rounds, which was what all the male cadets aspired to. When I put this to Fitzy, he suggested I was a ghoul. Apart from Bob, Fitzy and the Sergeant Major, like B. Warren, had the unenviable job of knocking me into shape, and somehow I got through that challenging first year and became a D grade. Someone, probably Bob, pinched my file from B's drawer and informed me that I was the most improved cadet that year, though clearly it was off an extremely low base. So here I stand before you many decades later as someone who's made a career of journalism, thanks to that baptism of fire at the old Melbourne Herald, and is now imparting her knowledge and experience to Monash University journalism students. I'd never have made it in today's environment, which can only make me wonder what other gems are lost to the profession in these straitened times. Getting and retaining a cadetship now sounds like a version of Game of Thrones. At Fairfax, I believe, they take on interns with no guarantee of a job at the end of their servitude. The Herald Sun's not much different. Yet we continue to turn out journalism graduates who are no less keen and determined than we are. Plus, they have the benefit of being taught by experienced practitioners, for I'm no academic and simply teach by deconstructing everything I learned along the way, mostly by osmosis, imitation and mentoring. So, big question, does journalism have a future? Of course it does. People will always want information and they thrive on stories. Sure, the means of delivery have changed and we're in the process of evolution that feels like revolution. But I don't want to bang on about broken business models. We've all heard enough about that. Thanks for allowing me the opportunity to bang on at all, and a special thanks to David Harrison for herding us all together for this mini festival, and to Ken Davis, who I think we're going to hear from on Saturday down at the Emerald, who is really responsible for a lot of other gatherings over the years and for keeping this family together. Thank you.
Please welcome Ranald Macdonald.
Hi to you all. It's great to be here as the token age person, but I do see some people who were at the age here, and so it's good to be amongst some of you. Just watching that film, great line to begin with, people make papers. I thought that was really significant, particularly as I gather that the Age is about to close Washington, which would seem not a good decision in the middle of a presidential year. People make papers. Well, without people, without the stories, without original work, you can't sell papers, can you? Well, thanks to Mark and to David for organising, and to Alan, just welcome you and your daughter, Kay, because I think Alan has stood up for all that we believe in journalism, and I really am really proud of meeting him the other day, but also with what he's been doing. So terrific. Now I will be brief, but Michael, and I will get back to the subject, but Michael said, and many of you in this room will be really interested in this, how's Collingwood going to go this year? And I said, well, after all, we, the Mighty Magpies, have been a staple for the Herald and Sun for a long time with the real and imagined problems of the club. So we've, right from the pink paper days, we've been a front page regular. And so I think it's great that we're back in the news again. And as you can see, our players, our leading players anyway, are in terrific shape. Women's Day has made it very clear in the photographs of Swanee and Clokey, they're ready. But I was a bit surprised to see in that august journal, that magazine, Women's Day, that they featured that particular item. I wasn't sure how it fitted in the Women's Day mission statement. I mean, Women's Day and Women's Weekly had a rather different approach to news in my day. And I looked it up and I realized, which I should have known, I suppose, that the German company Bauer Media Group owns both those magazines and another 60 titles, and its overall editorial policy, if you want to look it up on the web, is "We think popular." We think popular. Anyway, I was asked by David Harrison, who clearly drew my name out of a hat, to chat about the 60s and 70s, and I will be brief about it, because those, I know we get all nostalgic and we think we were part of the great days, but it is really true when you look back at it in the late 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and the Sun was selling, 640,000 it got to, I think. The Herald got over 500,000. Two of the great newspapers. The Sun represented Melbourne thinking. It had many campaigns that were terrific, like, preserve the parks of Melbourne. It had such an influence and did represent the community. It was one of the great tabloids. And then, and I say tabloid not being disrespectful, because The Age is now a compact tabloid. It's not just tabloid, it's compact. But it was an extraordinary level of sales that we had. The Age was 130,000 when the Argus closed, that's the mid-50s. It picked up some of the Argus, and the Argus was a damn good paper, but two-thirds, I think, of the Argus sales went to the Sun, and we picked up a third. So when I got in, which actually was 1 year before that film, because Keith Sinclair was still editor, Graham Perkin came the year after Keith Sinclair left. So it was, would have been 1965 that Fred Skepsey did that film. But we got through changes and through trying to make the paper more relevant, we got it up to nearly 250,000. What people don't realise, many, is that the peak was reached under Michael Davey. And certainly Graham did all of the hard yakka and changed the paper and everything else, but Michael Davey carried it on after Graham's tragic death. And I just wanted to touch a little on I just wanted to touch on one other thing. Both the Herald and Weekly Times, it was called the Herald Weekly Times, of course, but you had the Weekly Times, we had the Leader. In those days, the paper really serviced the country with the Leader and the Weekly Times. The newspapers covered the whole of Victoria, and sadly that's not true. Well, then of course the National Times came along, and with Max Such and Evan Whitten, and the Truth sputtered along, and sadly Newsday didn't, but that's another story. The papers were huge in their size, quite apart from the circulation. They were thick with ads, and therefore there was a bit of money to spend. And just one last point about magazines. I talked about the Women's Day before, but don't forget Women's Weekly was selling 1 million copies, and weekly, not the Women's Weekly monthly as it is now. And there were TV Week, and there was Women's Day, and Clio, which was born, I think, in 1972, just closed. And we started the Business Review Weekly, and the extraordinary thing about that was, BRW, we got to 100,000 a week with a financial magazine, there were big sales in those days, and people really read their newspapers and magazines. It comes back to people make papers. It's people, it's journalists, and it's so tragic, and I feel rather sad with all the latest news about the Age and where it's going. My first links and contact with the dreaded Flinders Street opposition was when I started as a journalist, and I'll be very brief about my journalistic career, but I did start with doing shipping movements, that sort of thing, and I did the city courts, and that incorporated the licensing court and the county court and a coroner's court and the arbitration commission. I saw Bob Hawke in action with all his enthusiasm and his enthusiastic drinking as well. But the person who was really important to me was Col Brennan. And Col Brennan was one of the most remarkable, Colin Brennan. You'd know him from, he was part of the AJA, but he was a real gentleman. He did a brilliant job for the Sun. Then I ended up on Town Hall round. Barry Muir was there, but it was a good round. It was a really interesting round. There was a lot of news. We had, I don't want to drop names because you saw some of them in the paper, but it was rather funny to see old Jack Darmody there as the police roundsman and various others. A couple of stories about those days which might amuse you. There I was as a 26-year-old, and I went to the first meeting of the Newspaper Publishers Association in Sydney. And Frank Packer was there in a very belligerent mood. Rupert Murdoch had just, of course, bought the Mirror and purchased the Mirror and was the new kid on the block. Old Rags Henderson, tough bugger he was. And there were a few others there. But the main players were those. And this was my first meeting with these other characters. I know there were characters in the journalistic community and some of you here today, but there certainly were characters when you put Ezra Norton and people like that, but I'm a little after him. But when you look at the people who were in newspapers and ran them and ran the media, they were characters. Anyway, in comes Packer, and he sees me, and just to make a point, I was at school with his son, Kerry, who I knew pretty well. He just gave me his hat and coat. He knew I was the managing director. He was trying to sort of make a point very early on. Anyway, they sat down, and before the meeting started, and of course, trade practices, things like that didn't come in. There was a prior agreement that the production unions would only get a small percentage increase, and all organisations agreed to that. However, they were still negotiating, and so we were meeting over that. The first thing that happened was that Packer said, "Well, Murdoch, I've just met with the chapel father. He tells me that you're saying that I'm the one that's blocking the pay rise, so we're giving them what they want." And so Murdoch said, "Well, that doesn't matter to me." He said, "After all, Braggs, your company, you're going to have to pay 3 times the payroll increase we do because you've got 3 times as many people. You, Frank, you've got twice as much. We're only a third, so we'll be improving our position." And with that, Frank Packer took his hat and his coat and left. And that was the end of the first meeting. It lasted about 5 minutes. My other sort of the thorns in my side, I suppose, apart from some of the things back at the Age, included the closeness of Jack Williams with his close friend and drinking companion, Henry Bolte. Because when there were a lot of things that sort of they worked out together. I think the one area they split on was hanging, but capital punishment. But we had geared and employed 50 people for the Sunday paper, which of course Tim Hewitt was brought out here as a Sunday newspaper editor, not a daily newspaper editor, not an evening newspaper editor. He was a Sunday editor. And we'd got 50 or 57 people on the payroll, brought in people from South Africa, and we kept the thing secret because we couldn't go to politicians. We knew the first thing they'd do would go around and see Jack Williams, and we'd be in even worse trouble than it turned out we were. So anyway, we were about to publish, and we were all ready, and we even prepared the ads. And then Bolte said, "You can't do it, it's Sunday work." Well, if you think about it, there's more Sunday work for a Monday paper. But he banned it. He stopped the Sunday paper. And of course, we didn't have Sunday papers for many years. Then the big issue was, what do you do with the extra staff? What do you do with all the planning and whatever? And so with a little bit of overconfidence and underestimating the skills and brilliance and depth and all the other things that you represent in this room, the Herald was a tough competition. And of course, we put aside 1 year's cash flow to it, and it didn't work, and that was a sad day. I just want to touch on another thing, and that is, well, of course, journalists and whether we need them, but I just absolutely believe that journalists are more needed now than ever before, and I totally agree with Jan on that. Incidentally, I think the youngest grandmother I've seen. Anyway, yeah, this last year, right? Anyway, a good example of that is if you look up Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia, and one of you, I don't know why you haven't done this, you ought to look at the way that you are represented in Wikipedia. It refers to the paper living for 150 years, the Herald, and it refers to, it had such journalists as Tess Lawrence, Lawrence Money, and Weg, whose cartoons on the football finals became an institution. That is the summary of your 150 years of journalism. Look at Wikipedia and you'll see Tess Lawrence, Lawrence Money, and Weg. So it's not a lot for 150 years. I don't know why you've done so well. But seriously about journalists, and this is really where I am being serious, you have to have something, and that's why I was referring to Wikipedia. It needs a journalist to actually put things in perspective and get it right and have some background. Without journalists, however good the social media are, or various aspects of the social media are, however good they are, you do need some sort of perspective, some sort of editing, some sort of experience. And journalism provides that. And I just can't believe that, that in the end, we're going to rely, as we've become too much to rely on in the newspapers that we have now, and I don't take the age out of this statement, just on carrying spokespeople, politicians and others because they're cheap. You have to be able to have some interpretation, some perspective. You also have to have some sort of background. Always when people talk about balance in journalism, I say it's not balance we look for, it's fairness. Fairness over a period. We all rely on sources, we all rely on leaks, we all rely on like in a court case, you have the beginning is the prosecution, and the person's clearly guilty. There's absolutely no doubt about it. The prosecution, the case is so clear, so you give that huge headlines because it's certainly much more dramatic than a defence. But then the important thing is we all learnt, and we had people in the newspapers who used to check that there was a balance, or fairness, the defence is given space too. And then, which sadly happens now sometimes when you read stories, you don't even get the result if the person is not guilty. And certainly if you do, it's right on the very, very back pages when the prosecution's case has been on the front pages. And it just seems to me that the one thing we need and the one thing we're looking for is a sense of perspective, of credibility, and of fairness, and that, I'm afraid, is lacking in too many areas. And I'm going to end just with this. Those of you who were there with Laurie Oakes when he spoke at the press club would, I think, have applauded what he said. But he ended like this. A free press does need to be a respected press. That's because if we're going to safeguard the utmost freedom to report, if we're going to win political arguments like those I've been discussing, we need the public behind us. Most of us in this room, most people in the media probably assume we've got the public support. But have we? We've seen survey after survey, poll after poll, showing a deep and deepening lack of trust in the media. In the light of that, what basis do we have for assuming there is widespread public sympathy when it comes to press freedom questions? The only way to guarantee it is to start winning back respect, rebuilding trust. That obviously involves lifting our game, but trying to project a more positive picture of what we do and why, the significance of journalism. That wouldn't be a bad idea either. And that's one area, sadly, that when I look back at what were remarkable years, the 60s, the 70s, and 80s for me anyway, and I realised that there was great competition, but there was also respect for journalism, even respect for scoops. That sadly has deteriorated, and it seems to me there's an awful lot of petty point scoring off the opposition and denigrating other people in the same profession as one is in, and it reflects, it seems to me, on the credibility of journalism as a whole. Thank you for inviting me.